aspects of disarmament. Now, because of the limited time, I'm really going to mainly focus on nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons, although there's a lot more to be said about general military spending, but I don't think there'll be time. And I'm not really sure how much or how many of you are familiar, or how familiar you are with the current sort of state of nuclear weapons and the campaigning and so on. So I'm going to start from fairly basic kind of premise. And also, because this is a cafe economique, I thought there should be some economics in it, but I don't really know an awful lot about economics. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the costs of COVID. This is what we're going to go through tonight: the effects and costs of COVID, the COVID threat and the COVID wake-up call. Because COVID, there's no doubt that COVID has changed the way we behave and perhaps the way we think about things generally. And so we just go through some of those aspects. Then the link with nuclear weapons is that they both really are international threats, but nuclear weapons is much worse, in fact, than COVID. So I'll talk about the doomsday clock. I'll explain that as we go along. Then what the nuclear threat consists of, the effects of nuclear weapons, how many nuclear weapons there are, and the costs of those things. And then in particular, Britain's nuclear weapons, in case you're not that familiar with that, with the Trident system. Then coming on to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which is the latest, I guess, piece of progress that we can make or we can talk about in terms of disarmament. And then finish off really with how have the treaty and COVID changed international norms, and what does this mean for the future? So let's start with the first slide, the second slide, I guess, or even the third slide, the effects of COVID. So the coronavirus pandemic has reached almost every country in the world. It has a truly global spread. Its spread has left national economies and businesses counting the costs as governments struggle with new lockdown measures to tackle the spread of the virus. Despite the developments of new vaccines, many are still wondering what recovery will look like. And we have tomorrow, of course, we've got the budget. So we'll find out some of what's in store for us and the kind of effects that COVID has had on what we're able to do with our economy, or what the Conservatives feel we should be doing with our economy anyway. So there's been big shifts in stock markets, which can affect the value of pensions or individual savings accounts. The FTSE, Dow Jones, Industrial Average, and the Nikkei all saw huge falls as the number of COVID-19 cases grew in the first few months of the crisis. The major Asian and US stock markets have recovered following the announcement of the first vaccine in November, but the FTSE is still in negative territory, as we can see here. So this is the impact of coronavirus on stock markets since the start of the outbreak. Now, this is about as far as my economics will probably go, but and I'm sure you're all familiar with this anyway. But the other effect that it has had is on unemployment. And although the government has done quite a lot really to try to make sure this is not a huge impact by using the furlough system, etc., there still has been a big effect on unemployment, increasing in most countries, and the UK as well, not as much as the US or Canada, but still it's going to be something that is really going to be a problem for us for some time to come. So can we put any costs on the COVID? In terms of what it's affected globally, we've now reached unprecedented levels of government expenditure, massive drop in income to the government, huge levels of unplanned government borrowing. There's a lot of future uncertainty. We don't know when we'll be able to get back to normal exactly, and how that normality or that so-called normality will look. And we are facing the biggest economic problems since the Second World War, basically. So in terms of some costs, you can see here that according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, government borrowing will be something like £394 billion for the current financial year, that is April 2020 to April 2021. And they also say that the UK's national debt will be huge. You can see, oh, you can't, I don't know if you can see on that graph because the screens may be in the way, but basically it's the 21st century so far. I'm reading off the bottom here. As a result of the pandemic, the public sector net debt has risen by £316.4 billion over the 10 months since last April, to an all-time high of £2.1 trillion. We normally do have a large national debt, but this is really enormous. I think it's bigger than it's ever been before. So the pandemic has been given us some global threats, which are common to a lot of nations, and certainly in the Western sort of world. But it's not an existential threat. Though it's lethal on a massive scale, the pandemic is not threatening all life on Earth. And COVID-19 will not obliterate civilization. It will recede eventually. But this is not the case of nuclear war. The potential for the world to stumble into nuclear war actually increased in 2020. The global failure to address the existential threats of nuclear weapons tightened its grip in the past year, increasing the likelihood of catastrophe. Governments have also failed to sufficiently address climate change. A pandemic-related economic slowdown temporarily reduced the carbon dioxide emissions that cause global warming, but over the coming decade, fossil fuel use needs to decline precipitously if the worst effects of climate change are to be avoided. And instead, fossil fuel development and production are projected to increase. Now, some of you may already be familiar with this idea of the doomsday clock, which was founded in 1945 by Albert Einstein and the University of Chicago scientists who helped to develop the first atomic weapons in the Manhattan Project. It was created, the doomsday clock was created just 2 years later. And it's set every year by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and their Science and Security Board in consultation with the board of sponsors, which includes 13 Nobel laureates. The idea is to see how close the world may be to some catastrophic problem, such as nuclear weapons. And originally it was set up to see how close we were to Armageddon due to a nuclear war. Now, in the last few years, they've actually added climate change to that, because climate change gives the same kind of threat in terms of its extent as nuclear weapons would, or a nuclear war would. So it's at the moment, it's set to 100 seconds to midnight, midnight being the time when Armageddon occurs. That's the closest it's been in the entire history of the clock. And it was the same 100 seconds last year. So this is the second year running that it's been this close. Despite having got rid of Donald Trump, there's still a few problems remaining in the world's political and social structure. So on the 23rd of January this year, that should be 2021, not 2020, sorry, on the clock. The statement We share a common concern over the failure of the multilateral system to address the existential threats we face. Our mechanisms for collaboration are being undermined when we need them the most. They consider, therefore, the international situation and the growing threats of climate change and nuclear weapons to be worse than it's ever been, even than last year. So this has kind of provided us, the COVID situation has provided us with a wake-up call. In 2020 alone, COVID-19 killed 1.7 million people and sickened at least 70 million more. The pandemic revealed just how unprepared and how unwilling countries and the international system are to handle global emergencies properly. And this is very worrying. In this time of genuine crisis, governments too often abdicated responsibility, ignored scientific advice, did not cooperate or communicate effectively, and consequently failed to protect the health and welfare of their citizens. As a result, many hundreds of thousands of human beings died needlessly. COVID has, however, demonstrated how closely linked we all are around the world and the need for international cooperation and understanding to tackle urgent global problems, such as the pandemic, but also in terms of climate change. It's emphasized the need for cooperation and understanding for climate change and nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are an expanding concern. This is a kind of a figure that they produced, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It's a bit complicated, so we're not going to go too far into it, but these dots along the side here represent the number of states that actually have nuclear weapons, that possess nuclear weapons. So it started off down here in the 1940s with the USA, then was joined by Russia, the UK, and so on, until now we have 9 states with nuclear weapons. Here is in this part of the graph or the figure, you can see the nuclear treaties that have been discussed and agreed in the years since around the 1960s, 70s, mainly to do with nuclear testing, but also to do with the number of nuclear weapons that Russia and America in particular hold. So we won't go too much into that. It's rather complicated, but it's an interesting way of putting a whole lot of data into one figure, I think. So this is the number of nuclear weapons that Russia has had, number of warheads really, and the number of warheads that the United States, and this is the inventory of all countries. So the number of warheads, in fact, has dropped off significantly since the 1980s, since the height of the Cold War, basically. However, there's still enough, although that doesn't look many compared with what it was, there's still enough to destroy the world several times over. So if they're ever used, we are still presented with a huge problem. And of course, the human impact is well known now of these bombs. The victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of which survived long enough to tell their tale and to tell the tales of others. We know that destructive capability, we know the medical problems that are left after a nuclear bomb has been exploded. And the thing about the nuclear weapons that is different from COVID, there's many things, but COVID at least leaves an infrastructure untouched, more or less. So we still have hospitals, we still have doctors, we still have places where we can go to buy food. In the event of a nuclear war, there would be none of that. There'd be no help, no assistance. There'd be no water to drink. It would be contaminated by radiation. So we would be faced with a huge, much bigger problem than the COVID has presented us with. Some of you may remember this little document called Leeds in the Bomb, which was produced back in the 1970s. I can't remember the year. I think it was 1983. It showed it was at the time of the height of the Cold War, more or less, and showed the effects of a 1 megaton ground burst on Leeds if it was dropped in the center of Leeds. Well, there's 1 megaton is probably quite high for a nuclear missile, but there is another way of looking at this, and there's a simulation which is offered by a website, which is, sorry, I should have shown you this one here. If you go to this website, you'll be able to indicate where you want the bomb to drop, how big you want the bomb to be, and then see what the consequences are. So, for example, here is the consequences of a bomb dropped in the center of Leeds. This is a bomb, a W87 type bomb, which is equivalent to, it's an American warhead, 300 kilotons. It's what's put on the US Minuteman III missiles. And so it's not a huge bomb, but it's, you know, probably a fairly standard type size, I guess. So the extent of the various problems associated with the nuclear weapon are shown in different colors there. The white, right at the center is the fireball. That's the central area. And the circle shows the maximum radius of the fireball, which would burn at something like 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. In the first millionth of a second after detonation, the bomb material heats up to extremely high temperatures, and the fireball emits an enormous amount of energy as X-rays, light, and heat. Anything or anyone inside the fireball would be instantly vaporized. The whiter areas, the gray kind of colored areas immediately after that are the area of radiation. Shortly after the detonation, the nuclear materials emit a burst of radiation in the form of gamma rays and neutrons, and these particles damage the human body at a cellular level. Absorbing too many in a short period results in acute radiation poisoning. People at this radius would absorb a potent dose 800 times greater than the average annual exposure. Of those who survive the heat and shockwave, 50 to 90% will die a painful death from radiation poisoning within a few hours to a few weeks. The orange area is the shockwave area. As the fireball quickly expands, it forces back the surrounding air, creating a shock wave. And the shock front, an invisible destructive force, moves out from the center of the blast. At this particular radius, which just about comes to Chapel Allerton, as you can perhaps see from the map there, the pressure of the shock wave is strong enough to destroy most buildings, except for those that are reinforced. Hurricane force winds accompany the shock front, adding to the destruction. The human body might survive a significant pressure jump and high winds, but anyone in this area is likely to be injured or killed by collapsing structures or wind-blown debris. The red area is the area of where affected by heat, and the explosion produces intense heat that causes catastrophic damage. Anyone within this radius would have severe or fatal third-degree burns. Wood, clothing, paper, and plastics would catch fire. Even outside this boundary, the heat would still be intense enough to cause first and second-degree burns. And then there would be fallout contamination, which can extend far beyond the blast and thermal effects, particularly in the case of high-yield surface detonations. This is a surface detonation. You can run the simulation again to get an airburst. That is one that would be exploded before it hits the ground, increasing the range of the damage that's caused. So in fact, if it was an airburst rather than a surface burst, the number of casualties would be 205,772 deaths and 364,360 injuries, compared with this is just a bit less than 150,000 fatalities and 190,000 injuries. And don't forget, if this did happen, there would be no hospitals left. The LGI, Jimmy's would be gone. There'd be no infrastructure. There'd be no roads effectively. no water, it would be it would be a complete and utter devastation. And this is the effect of just one bomb, and there are thousands of bombs waiting to be used on the many missiles and bombers that are still around internationally. So recent studies have actually shown that even a limited war would cause abrupt climate freezing, rainfall disruption, and significant, sorry, I'm trying to change the slide here, but it doesn't seem to want to go. Huh. Oh, there we go. So even a limited war would cause abrupt climate freezing and rainfall disruption through this thing called a nuclear winter, which many of you will have heard about. All of the dust and the debris is that's lifted up into the upper atmosphere by the explosion and by the thermals produced by the explosion, will stay up in the higher atmosphere for some time and block out the rays of the sun, perhaps for many months or even years. And this would cause a nuclear winter, what's called the nuclear winter. Because of this, then you would get a sudden change in climate, or a gradual change in climate, freezing rainfall, agricultural collapse, and no infrastructure to support the survivors. Nuclear-induced famine would kill billions of innocent civilians. Somewhere around about 1.1 to 2 billion would die of starvation. And this is the estimates of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Scottish CND did a report a few years ago now on what would happen, what would be the effects of if Britain fired its Trident missiles. Now, in 2013, it was confirmed by Nick Clegg, who was in government at that time, that Trident was still designed at that time to flatten Moscow. So if Trident did fire its missiles, Scottish CND calculated that if you take into account the most likely targets, it would probably result in 5.4 million deaths and injuries. And that's just from one submarine's worth of missiles targeted on one city. These are the nuclear numbers that exist at the moment. And these are figures taken from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Every year they issue figures on nuclear warheads, on spending, on the military spending of each country in the world, and so on. And we're just about, I think in April, they're going to issue the figures for the next year, for 2021. But this is from their yearbook last year. So the United States has a total inventory of 5,800 warheads, of which 1,750 are actually deployed. That means they're on missiles or in bombs that could be dropped relatively quickly. Russia has 1,570. France has 280. The UK has 120 on its Trident submarines. France has a mixture of delivery systems. It has bombers and submarines. We have just the submarines. So as you can see, in total, throughout the world, there are 3,750 deployed warheads ready to be launched at a moment's notice, really. And others, there are 10,000 others around ready to be deployed if needed. So these things cost money, of course, and these are the figures that have been calculated as the costs of these weapons systems from the various countries that have them. These figures were calculated or put together by ICAN, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, when it issued a report just last year on this particular topic. As you can see there, the UK is put in the block here as spending $8.9 billion per year on nuclear weapons. It's the third highest from China, from the United States, then China, then the UK, and then Russia. So we spend more than Russia, mainly because we're replacing the current Trident missile system with a new submarines and missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads. This figure of 8.9 billion was actually calculated mainly by CND some while ago now. If you've seen a figure of 205 billion pounds per year, that's the, or not, well, 205 billion pounds rather, sorry, not per year. That's the figure that CND arrived at for the total costs of nuclear weapons throughout the lifetime of the new system and the cost of putting the new system into operation. So what does this new system consist of? Well, it's got a new submarine set up called the Dreadnought. This is the Trident submarine system here, or Trident submarine. This is the Dreadnought replacement. As I mentioned, the estimated total cost is something like 205, or it'll be more than that now, billion pounds. The cost goes up almost every year, well, every year really, and it's overrunning as well in the time it's supposed to take to develop these things. This is normal procedure with nuclear material, nuclear projects, whether it be nuclear power stations or whether it be nuclear weapon systems. So the UK annual spending is 7.2 billion pounds, the third highest in the world. And the program, this particular program for renewal of the Trident system includes 1.8 billion pounds for the submarines. I'm pointing out these figures because although they're quite small compared with the total cost of the COVID problem that we've had, it could still contribute a lot to a recovery program if we were able to put 205 billion pounds, move it, shift it away from nuclear weapons into some kind of recovery system to help with the welfare state, to help with the National Health Service. Just imagine how much easier things might be. So the other aspect, another aspect of the weapon system is the missiles. They're actually not UK missiles, they're US missiles. We don't own the missiles, we just lease them from the United States, but still it costs us money. We still have to pay for that. And that, you can't see the figure there, I don't think, but it's, I can't remember what it is without seeing it. It's something like 1.4 billion pounds for the missiles and warheads. The missiles, as I say, are leased from the United States. The United States is updating all of its subsystems, the launcher, the navigation system, the fire control, the guidance system, missile, and the re-entry system, and all of those will be incorporated into the new UK system. And this is really the reason why we have to change our system. The Trident system is because the Americans are changing theirs. They're upgrading their system into something called the Ohio class submarine system. And so we have to do ours too in order for the missiles to fit and so on, and the systems to be compatible. Then there's the warheads on top of the missiles, and the warheads are being modified to be more accurate. And it was disclosed a few months ago, really, that the warhead would be the same as the US Mark 7 W93 warhead that they use on their submarine system. And it's being developed by Lockheed Martin, who are producing that, and the UK re-entry systems. And the US and the UK work very closely together on these programs. They're also working on a new arming, fusing and firing system to enable more accuracy so these things can be more accurate. Now, there's two things about that. First of all, the government of all governments always claim that we have an independent nuclear force. Well, you've probably seen from this that that's complete nonsense. It's not independent at all. It's totally dependent on the United States. They also say it's for so-called deterrence. If that was true as well, you would not need the warheads to be so accurate. You wouldn't need them to be able to be targeted within just a meter or so of their target, because you just want to be able to say, we threaten you with these, and we would destroy cities. It wouldn't matter whereabouts in the city. So this is obviously being designed in order to strike first at the missile silos of some enemy, so that you can destroy their way of hitting back once you've had a first strike system. So Trident system was a first strike system. The new system will be even more so. We also, of course, have these nuclear convoys that run up and down the country from Burfield and Aldermaston in the south, where the nuclear bombs are designed and manufactured at Burfield. They come up the motorways to be loaded onto the submarine systems here in near Glasgow in Faslane, where the submarines are berthed. And they're actually stored, the nuclear weapons are stored in Coalport close by. So every month or so, you get these convoys coming up either this route along the M6 or this route along the M1. And they travel through or close to cities like Leeds without any warning. There is a group of people, dedicated people, Nuke Watch, who keep their eyes on these things to make sure that we know when these things are coming up. And there's a group of people, some in Leeds. I think I saw Hugh on the list of people attending this. He's one of them that rushes out to check to see how many carriers there are. This is a carrier ward. It goes along police, escorts, decontamination units, ambulances, etc., that might be needed. And very often these things break down and cause all sorts of problems. So this is all part of the nuclear infrastructure. These wagons, these convoy vehicles alone cost £1 million. So it's a huge sum of money just to keep the thing going, never mind developing the things in the first place and building the stuff in the first place. So what's causing this expenditure on nuclear weapons? Why is there such a desire, or what is there such a desire, and where does that come from? Does it come from the British public? Are they demanding it? Well, just recently, a national poll conducted in January for CND showed that 59% of the public, general public in the UK, support the UK government signing up to the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which we'll come to in a moment. And that includes 50% of Conservative voters and 68% of Labour voters. Even despite that, you will have seen recently, I think, the Labour leadership saying that the UK use, or the UK possession of nuclear weapons, was non-negotiable in its own terms. 77% of the British public support a total ban on all nuclear weapons globally, including 71% of Conservative voters and 83% of Labour voters. Both the UK signing the TPNW and a total global ban have majority support across every single demographic in terms of age, regions and nations, education level, income bracket, 2019 GE vote and 2016 EU referendum vote. So where is the support for this? There is no public support for these nuclear weapons. Most people want them to be got rid of. So what all this talk that all major parties give you about needing them for deterrence or because they want to protect the public. This is the politicians are always saying we desperately need to keep nuclear weapons, that they're cheap, which they're obviously not, and a cheap way of deterring other nations. There is another side, of course, big business. And the world's largest arms producing companies are all of them involved in nuclear weapons at some point or another. Lockheed Martin, the biggest arms producing company in the world, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and so on. They're all involved in the nuclear weapons programs. So they are mostly, they are all, apart from BAE Systems, based in America, and they are lobbying the politicians there to produce more, to build more, to have higher tech systems. And it's become part of the electoral scene, really, that they support both parties, Democrats and Republicans. They pump money into both parties. They put these huge industries scatter them across all the states, so that if any of them were to close, it would cause big unemployment problems, etc., etc. So I would suggest that this was one of the main pushing kind of agents to keeping nuclear weapons going. And what about the United Nations? What does that have to say about all of this? Well, international law is enshrined in conventions, treaties, and standards. And many of these treaties are brought about by the United Nations, and they form the basis of the law that governs relations among nations. There is not a limited number, apart from nuclear testing, which has more or less been worldwide stopped now, apart from North Korea, I guess. Any kind of disarmament treaty doesn't really exist. The only ones up until fairly recently was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that was open for signature in July 1968 and actually entered into force in 1970. And this is based on a central bargain. The NPT non-nuclear weapon states, those that have signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty but have nuclear weapons, agree never to acquire, but don't have nuclear weapons, sorry, agree never to acquire them. And the countries with nuclear weapons agree to pursue nuclear disarmament aimed at the ultimate elimination of their nuclear arsenals. Now, at the time of this treaty coming into force, there were 5 nuclear weapon states: America, Russia, China, UK, and France. So they've signed the treaty as nuclear weapon states. Those that developed the nuclear weapons a bit later, like India, Pakistan, Israel is never disclosed that it actually has nuclear weapons, although it's fairly clear that it does. They have not signed the treaty, because if they did sign the treaty, they'd have to immediately, or they'd have to get rid of their nuclear weapons before they signed the treaty. And they don't seem to be prepared to do that at the moment. So 190 states are party to the treaty, and only 5 are not: India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, which was a party to the treaty but then withdrew in order to develop its nuclear weapons, and Taiwan. No nuclear weapons treaty has actually, or no new nuclear weapons treaty has come about since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. And no agreement even to begin, except for 3 weeks in August 1998, until what happened in 2016. And what happened then was that in the December of that year, the UN General Assembly confirmed the first committee decision to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. And this came about after years of campaigning and global kind of protests at nuclear weapons. And eventually this came together in the form of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, who helped to put together 3 international conferences in Norway, in Austria, and in Mexico, which brought significant members of nation states around the world together to talk about this issue and to come to some kind of agreement. And in July 2017, the UN actually adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It was a great day for us campaigners who've been trying to get something like this on the cards for many years. And it was a day of celebration. And then on January, it didn't actually come into, the treaty didn't come into force until 50 states had signed and ratified it. And that actually happened. The 50th state signed, or ratified rather. The difference between signing and ratifying is the ratification of the signature of the states has to go through the parliaments of that particular country. So that state has to, first of all, an ambassador or whoever has to sign the treaty, and then that has to be agreed by the parliament of that country. And sometimes that takes a little while. And in January that happened. The treaty came into force. There was a lot of celebration. It was mainly online because we weren't allowed to go out and meet each other, unfortunately. But across the Yorkshire region, there was, Sheffield produced all these flags of all the countries of the world and displayed them. This was one in Leeds by, in fact, it was Hugh who developed that outside his house. You may have seen it. And various people did all sorts of other things to celebrate. In Leeds, we got a tree planted in Park Square here, and also the UN flag was flown from the Civic Hall, and all kinds of things were happening in different places around. So what does this treaty actually say? Well, it's pretty comprehensive. I won't go through it all, but it basically is been the thing that we've been waiting for a long time. There can be no doubt about the fact that if you sign this treaty, you will have nothing to do with nuclear weapons in the future at all. You won't develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, etc., nuclear weapons. And it goes on for another whole list here. You won't receive the transfer or control of nuclear weapons, use or threaten them, assist, seek or receive. All of those things will be banned by signatories of this particular treaty. So it's a major step forward. Of course, at the moment, no nuclear weapon state has signed it, but the pressures on them are growing as more and more countries do sign and ratify it. There are over 15 now who have signed, and over 80 who have signed rather, and over 50, I can't remember, 3 or 4 who have signed and ratified the treaty now. Now, there is a way you can join if you are a nuclear state. You can do it in 2 ways. You can either sign and negotiate a timetable and conditions for elimination of your nuclear weapons. So this would apply to states like the UK, NATO and Japan can also join by fulfilling these obligations. Or you can eliminate your nuclear weapons and then join the treaty. So there are a number of different ways of doing so. And CND recently put out a report. What does this mean? What does the treaty mean for the UK? What steps could the UK take? So basically, security treaties like the TPNW establish the laws, build international norms, promote national and collective action, and enable further steps to strengthen the rules-based international order that has done so much to encourage predictable behavior by states and the non-violent management of disputes as recognized by British diplomats as recently as 2016. So it is these laws, these treaties that form international norm. Now, whereas before we didn't have a treaty which had this kind of norm, the NPT was the only one that came close to it, and that didn't come close enough because the nuclear weapon states have been using the NPT as a way of keeping their nuclear weapons rather than negotiating them away like they promised to do. So though the treaty doesn't legally bind states that have not signed, like the UK, ignoring it is not really very realistic. As proposed by the House of Lords report on rising nuclear risks in 2019, the UK government needs to do more to accept this reality and engage constructively with both the TPNW and the NPT, because they haven't really, if by renewing the Trident system, for example, by upgrading it to a more accurate, more powerful system, that is against certainly the spirit of the NPT, if not the letter of the law. So the recommendations made by this document are to engage constructively with the first meeting of state parties to the TPNW. Now that's due to appear within a year of it coming into force. We're not quite sure when that will be yet, but it will be held in Vienna in Austria. So we know where it will be, probably sometime later in the year, hopefully when people can actually meet together. We could freeze funding earmarked for the replacing and upgrading of the UK nuclear weapon system and rethink what will make Britain and the world safer and more secure in the 21st century. Certainly increasing the number and the accuracy of nuclear weapons does not make us safer. We could halt plans to develop new submarines and warheads and take concrete steps to diversify defense jobs from nuclear weapons towards security and disarmament, augmenting the technologies and skills for safe and secure elimination, disposal, and verification, where the UK has the potential to actually take a positive lead. So we try not to make people too unemployed, too dependent on nuclear weapon systems, but they will have skills that can be used elsewhere in the disarmament process. So to work for also to success of the next NPT review conference, which is now being scheduled for 2021, this year in August. It was due to take place last year, but was postponed because of the COVID problems. And they could accept the TPNW's role in taking states' obligations forward, especially with regard to Article 6 obligation of the NPT, which is to work together towards complete nuclear disarmament. So that really leaves us with just a question: how have the TPNW and COVID changed these international norms? We need to rethink again what we mean by certain things like security, like defense, like international cooperation. Nuclear weapons are now illegal under international law. Nuclear weapons and military spending on high-tech weapons systems are colonial ways of thinking. One of the major reasons I believe that British politicians want to stick with nuclear weapons is because they think it gives them some kind of special privilege and a way of still acting on the top table, if you like, of international discussions and so on. It gives you a kind of status, but it certainly in my eyes, it does give you a status, but not a high status, a very low one, in fact. So the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the planet in many extraordinary and negative ways. The leaders of the world nations could come out of this in two different ways. One, we could become more confident in the value of effective global cooperation, or they may emerge more mistrustful of multilateralism than they were before. I'm hoping that the first one will happen. There will actually will have gathered some confidence and some understanding of others in what has happened with this global pandemic. But I'm not sure that that will actually happen. A positive experience could lead to effective collaborations and a much better way of ensuring our security for the future. So I think I've probably talked long enough now. What can we do just to finish off? I think keep in touch with the developments on these kind of things and do whatever you can. You can't necessarily do an awful lot, but together we can make a difference. So writing letters, sending emails to national and local press, lobbying politicians. CND and ICANN have this campaign on developing banned communities, which means trying to engage your MPs, get them to sign a pledge for their support of the treaty, to get local politicians and local councils to pass resolutions and sign pledges to support the treaty. Work towards divestment. See if your pension fund, your bank actually invests money in nuclear weapons, and then write to them to ask them to stop doing that. And work on, and also we're also working on ways in which the industry may be diversified, so people don't lose their jobs if disarmament does actually occur. So support Yorkshire CND, of course, and support campaigns on military spending generally. And coming up in April, there will be global days of action on military spending around the world. The global campaign in terms of the UK is on the website demilitarise.org. Is it .org or .com? Can't see. I think it's .org.uk. And the global days of action on military spending are 10th of April to the 9th of May. And these dates were set by the Global Steering Group to include April the 15th, which is tax day in the United States, the largest arms spender by some margin of anyone else in the world. April the 26th, to release the release of the latest SIPRI figures on global military spending. And May the 1st, International Workers' Day, of course, and Europe's Day of Peace, which is May the 9th. So a few days in order to make the most of this particular international action by writing to papers, writing to MPs, joining in with the protests that are being organised. And there will be plenty within Yorkshire, I hope. You'll be able to keep track of that from the Yorkshire CND website. So I'm sure there are probably some comments and questions on all of this. Let's have a break, I think, and then come back to that. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Dave. Shall we unmute everybody? Oh, no, perhaps not. I think we'll have a break now. It's nearly past, so shall we say we'll reconvene at 25 minutes to 9? Is that okay for everybody?
Maybe a bit longer, maybe 10 minutes. Realistically, if people are going to get a cup of tea, maybe 10 minutes. Priscilla,
okay,
perhaps.
okay. 20 to 9 then?
Yeah.
20 minutes to 9.
Yeah.
Righto.